Howdy, friends. Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning here on Dollars and Cents. Welcome to the year 2020. This is our first radio program in the year 2020. And of course, that means that we're going to have to recap the exactness of our Fearless forecast. We talked a little bit about what our Fearless forecast was last week on the program for the year 2020. Gave you a healthy indication of how close our Fearless forecast was for the year 2019 and said that on this program we would sort of true up the numbers, if you will, for 2019. So we'll do that on the program. And then we thought, given that it is the first show of a new decade, that's unbelievable, isn't it? We thought we would spend some time talking a little bit about the decade that was before we get too deep into the roaring 20s, if you will. Maybe a roaring 20s part 2. Who knows? We'll see. We've got some thoughts on certainly the year ahead, and so we'll share that. Plus, did you make a New Year's resolution? Probably you did. Like most, it's probably the usual stuff. Exercise more, eat less, all that good stuff. Well, we wanted to share with you perhaps a New Year's resolution that would do well, particularly for investors, because at the end of the day, there are some things that you as an investor can always do better. So we thought that we would add one more to your New Year's resolution. Yes, we're a few days into the new year already, but it's never too late to kind of add one in at the sort of the last moment. So we will do that on the program today. If you're listening to our program live, that means it must be Sunday morning between the hours of 9 and 10, and you're listening to a radio, particularly a radio station called WFLA Orlando, News Radio, WFLA Orlando. If you're listening to us at any other time besides 9 to 10 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, that means that you have joined one of our podcasts or perhaps are looking at our YouTube channel where we put the program up on a video basis. So in order to find our channels, you just simply need to search any of your favorite podcast or video providers, search for Nelson Financial Planning, and lo and behold, you will find our channels. If you get lost along the way, you can always go to our website, nelsonfinancialplanning.com. Upper right-hand corner, there's a bunch of different icons. Click on the one that looks most familiar to you, and you will automatically get connected to our channel on those various venues. So we'll look forward to having you join us as a regular subscriber to our show on the social media platforms that are out there. So, Fearless forecast. Last week on the program, we recapped, but there was still 2 days left in the year. Monday and Tuesday of this past week were still in the prior year, and so consequently, we didn't quite know exactly where our Fearless forecast for the year 2019 would ultimately come out. It looked like we were coming in pretty close. Our Fearless forecast for the year 2019 was that the Dow Jones Industrial Average would close the year out at 28,400. We were very close. I think that may be perhaps our most accurate year. The Dow Jones Industrial Average actually closed on Tuesday, December 31, 2019 at 28,538. So that's pretty good. An accuracy of less than 0.5%. I'll tell you, if you can get an accuracy of less than 0.5% on a consistent basis, you're doing very, very well. Of course, here's the disclaimer. The reality is, before you think that we can foretell the future, be very, very careful of that. This is not an exercise in foretelling the future. It is, in fact, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek exercise that we've now been doing for over 3 decades. And if you look at our track record, well, we're half and half. Half the time we'll get pretty close, and the other half, well, we're less than accurate. Further emphasizing the need to make sure that you remain consistent as an investor, because nobody, I don't care what kind of software or gimmick they're selling, is able to predict things on a consistent basis. So remember, stay invested and make sure that you follow that as an investor. So why were we so accurate? Well, one of the reasons why we were so accurate is that we were of the opinion that the markets in 2019 would recover from the severe decline that happened in the fourth quarter of 2018. If you remember that period of time, November, December of 18, you'll remember that the markets were in the middle of going down by about 20%. And so we viewed the year as a year where it would be a recovery. I think last year we gave you the statistic of what the performance has been. If you kind of pull the camera back a little bit more and look just at the past 15 months, what you'll find is that the markets are up about 7%, a much more normal number in terms of historical trends. So calendar year 2019, clearly a recovery year, and certainly our accuracy on our fearless forecast was pretty darn good. No question at all about it. Looking ahead, 2020, we view the consumer as in pretty good shape. And if we look at savings rates have basically doubled from where they were 10 years ago. Consumer debt, and here's the tricky thing on this one. You always hear that in reference to the absolute magnitude of debt. And certainly those numbers are going up, but so too are all numbers going up, whether it's the economy, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, whatever it is, it's a bigger number now than it was 10 years ago. So a little bit of perspective, if you look at consumer debt relative to GDP, then what you'll find is that it's the lowest level that we've seen since 2003. So don't let anybody tell you the consumer's not in pretty good shape. They are. They've got more money, and they've got less debt relative to GDP. So combine that with low interest rates, strong labor market. Certainly there are clouds on the horizon, the election for one, the China trade deal, who knows whether that will actually come to pass. And so consequently, those are the kinds of things that can certainly get the market off track. But we suspect that, particularly when the election, as the year progresses through, you'll get some clarity on that. Certainly when November rolls around, there'll certainly be some clarity on the election. So we think a lot of those things will become clearer and a little bit more resolved, which is why last week on the program, we gave our fearless forecast that the Dow Jones Industrial Average would rise about 11% for the year, end the year at 31,600. We will see. We'll see, right? A lot can happen in the next 52 weeks. Of course, that means that you have to stay tuned to the program so that we can stay in touch and keep you informed along the way as to what's going on. So, January 1, 2020 marks the start of a new decade and the end of another. So we thought it would be good to sort of wrap up the prior decade on the program as well. And certainly when we talk about the 2010s, there was a tremendous amount of headlines that were all over the map. When we look back at the past 10 years, we'll find some fascinating developments, whether it be economically, whether it be socially, whether it be politically, that I think really bear conversation. So we'll go to a break. When we come back from the break, we'll talk specifically about some of the events from the past decade that certainly made some headlines and certainly drove the markets and the economy. So we'll do all of that when we return here on Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, News Radio, WFLA. Welcome back to the program, ladies and gentlemen. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. You're listening to Dollars and Cents, Central Florida's longest running radio program, and now, of course, a podcast and also appearing on video at our YouTube channel at Nelson Financial Planning. Our first show of the new decade. Isn't that amazing? It means that we need to take a moment and pause and sort of look back at the past decade. And certainly when you look at the headlines, there were certainly some dramatic headlines that occurred during the course of the past 10 years. Obviously, in an hour-long radio program, we don't have the opportunity to recap all, but certainly there was a wide range. Economically, it was, the decade started out, lest we forget, with a pretty major housing crisis, or a continuation of the recovery of that housing crisis. If you look at our feelers forecast back 10 years ago, for the year 2010, my father-in-law, Jack Nelson, was predicting a Dow of 12,500 at the end of the year, and I was predicting a Dow of 12,300. Pretty dramatic in terms of the numbers, especially if you compare them to where they are today, with the market closing out the decade at 28,500. Now, you may say, my goodness, well, that's a pretty good decade when I think about it from a market and an investment perspective. Surely that decade had to set some kind of a record in terms of its overall performance, because to go from the 12,000s up to the 28,000s and change as a market index, that had to have been just a tremendous decade. And certainly, if you look at the performance of the Dow Jones Industrial Average during that decade, of the decade of 2000, the 2010s, you'll find that it did, in fact, certainly went up. It went up a total cumulative amount of 170%. So that's pretty good, right? 170%. That's a really big number. But here is some perspective, if you will, on how that performance rates versus other decades. So if you look back at the past 100 years, so that's the 10 prior decades, in fact, the performance of the Dow for the past 10 years only ranks fourth on that list of the 10 past decades. So those that say that the market has really accelerated or really leapt to great heights, it's really more about the number and not about the actual return, because the actual return, when you compare it to prior decades, it's a decent decade, but it's kind of middle of the road, right? If you got 10 spots and you're number 4, I mean, you're kind of in the middle of the pack, right? I mean, the upper middle of the pack, so good for you. But at the end of the day, that's not a market that screams, oh my goodness, it was a time that was so outsized in terms of the return. So a little perspective obviously goes a long ways. Certainly the past decade was filled with a tremendous amount of social change, of political change, and also marred by a number of tragic events. If we think about the past 10 years, the school shootings and the mass shootings in this country really seemed to accelerate. It seemed like those almost became an occurrence on a regular basis, sadly. Perhaps the most tragic thing that happened over the course of the past 10 years. Certainly there were many others: the opioid epidemic, the school shootings, the continued terrorism on a regular basis around the globe. All of those were some pretty negative headlines. Socially, we saw a lot of change, particularly as it relates to same-sex marriages and the legalization of marijuana. So some big, major social changes over the course of the past 10 years. And then, of course, politically, we can't forget about that. I think there's certainly a lot of conversation about the political division in this country really exacerbated itself over the course of the past 10 years, going from Obama to Trump. And it seems to me that that will spill certainly over into the 20s. Perhaps, though, the hope is for the next decade that people realize that rather than not see the other's viewpoint or not even agree to engage in a conversation, perhaps we might come together a little bit more, particularly the folks in Washington, to help address some of the major issues that exist out there, particularly as it relates to finances. The reality is that on a financial front, if you think the government can continue to borrow and borrow money, folks, that's not going to help our children or our grandchildren. So hopefully the folks in Washington can perhaps use the next decade to be a little bit less politicized and ultimately have a meeting of the minds, if you will, as it relates to the overall perspective in terms of the finances and the financials of this great country of ours. So, other things that happen, and a little bit of a comparison, and we wanted to spend some time on this because these are certainly not the stories that you hear in the mainstream media. Very much mainstream media, very much doom and gloom, and really trying to emphasize the negative rather than the positive. But the reality is the past 10 years have actually been a decent decade, and perhaps that is nowhere seen more strongly in consumer sentiment. If you look at Gallup polls that were taking place in the year 2010, just 9%, so that's less than 1 in 10 of Americans thought it was a good time to find a job, a quality job here in this country. So less than 1 in 10. Fast forward 10 years, and today nearly 7 out of 10 Americans believe that you can find a quality job in this country. Now, obviously, that's a reflection of the recovery from 2008 and the housing crisis and the financial crisis that occurred. And so consequently, a lot of this decade was about the recovery from that. But those are pretty strong consumer sentiment numbers that I don't think we hear that much about in terms of the mindset of the consumer and the effect that that's going to have economically. Remember, the consumer is, in fact, one of the greatest drivers of the economy. And so consequently, as they feel, so too does go the economy. Now, if we pull back the lens and we look at human progress as a whole, global economic progress, and you start to look at some of these numbers, and you come to a very different conclusion than the catastrophe or the doom that always gets suggested in the mainstream media that's around the corner. When you start to look at some of these numbers, what you'll find is that human progress has changed dramatically over the course of the past 10 years. Extreme poverty, if you look at extreme poverty globally, today it's less than 10% of the population. 50 years ago, it was over half at 60%. That is tremendous progress for humankind. Global income inequality is down dramatically from where it was just 2 decades ago. Child mortality rates are at record lows again across the globe. These are all tremendous trends that have happened over the course of the past 10 years that I don't think we get much attention, don't get much play in the mainstream media because, again, their focus is more on trying to capture your attention. And obviously, bad news is much better than good. Child mortality, we said, down record low. Famine nearly extinct. Malaria, polio, and heart disease all on a rapid decline. And countries and people just fundamentally are using less stuff. This is a thing that you don't hear many people talk about because it sort of runs counter to some of the larger themes out there that you hear about. But the reality is, when you look at how people are using resources and how countries are using resources, what you'll find is that they are using less metal, less water, less land. And we'll have some very specific statistics on that when we return. So stay tuned on that through the break. And when we come back, we'll talk more about this notion of society and how much it has improved over the past decade. And we look forward to even more improvement in the next decade. We'll continue the conversation here on Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, News Radio, WFLA, Orlando. Welcome back to the program, Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning. We're doing a little recap of the past decade that was, and then we'll look forward to the next decade, the Roaring 20s, perhaps, part 2. Who knows? We'll talk about that here on the program. So before the break, we were kind of recapping some of the things that made headlines. Obviously, that's a wide range of social, economic, and political issues. The biggest thing economically is the different consumer mindset that exists today than did just 10 years ago. Remember, 10 years ago, we were coming out of that 2008 debacle that had to deal with the housing bust, the financial markets collapse, those types of things were very much weighing on people's mind. And back then, according to the Gallup polls that were being conducted back then, less than 1 in 10 Americans believed that that in America you could find a quality job, that it was a good time to find a quality job. Today, that number is nearly 7 out of 10 that believe that today you can find a quality job in America. That's a pretty significant difference, and that is a testament to the consumer. Remember, the consumer is the major driver of the economy here in the U.S., and rapidly around the world, the consumers in places like China and India and Europe are also becoming larger and larger drivers of those economies. And as the consumer goes, then so too does the economy. If the consumer is feeling 7 times better than what they did in the Gallup polls that occurred in 2010, it seems to me that that's a pretty good sign for the next decade as well. Certainly the decade starting off on a much stronger foot than the last decade did, that is for sure. So we believe some of these trends that have been occurring over the course of the past decade that basically represent a recovery from 2008 are certainly strong enough to continue well into the 20s. Stay tuned on that. The global trends, though, that are in fact occurring are directly related to the use of technology and how much technology has changed over the course of just this past decade. The reality is that people are using less, consuming less metal, less water, and less land to get to the same items. If you just simply look at a can of soda back in 1959, 85 grams in that can were made out of aluminum. Today, that number is 13 grams. Most of those are, in fact, made up of recycled material. That's a significant shift in how we use technology and how we use our raw material resources. Resources consumed over the course of the past 20 years have, in fact, fallen by about a third, which is much faster than the increase in the population. So consumers are using fewer resources. How is that possible? I think the single biggest explanation on that goes back to technology. The size of that mobile phone, the mobile phone that's recording this video, for example, has so much more computing power and is so much smaller when you stop and think about that. Think of that phone. That phone is very tiny, especially compared to the size of the computers that were used to put a man on a moon. We've all seen these rooms of computers, right? The computing power of those machines was a fraction of the computing power that's on your phone. A perfect example of how you're using less resources. Clearly less goes into that phone than in that room full of computers. LED light bulbs, another thing that gained rapid acceptance over the course of this past decade, in fact, use about a quarter of the electricity of traditional light bulbs. That is human inventiveness. That is human development. That is human progress. And we simply can look also at agriculture. Agriculture traditionally is the biggest consumer of water, right? It takes a lot of water to grow plants. I know that firsthand because every time I grow something, it usually withers and dies because I forget to water it. Anyway, the reality is that technology has played a massive part in agriculture. We use 65% less land than we did for agricultural purposes. How is that possible? How are we using 65% less land, but the population is so much greater? Well, it's technology. It's knowing when to water based upon measuring the soil and the water levels in the soil itself. So you're not overwatering, you're not underwatering, you're watering just right. That's the power of technology. And so consequently, in fact, we see forests expanding, we see resources getting used less, which is a sort of a direct contrast to what the mainstream media puts forth, because it doesn't do any good to say, hey, everything's great and it's only going to get better. That doesn't attract your attention. That doesn't attract minds. That doesn't attract eyes. That doesn't attract viewers. The reality is that if that was the message that the mainstream media was giving, then they'd fail. They wouldn't have anybody to listen to them. And so consequently, it has to be this constant doom and gloom, which I think is a fundamental effector of psychology, particularly now when so much information is on a mobile basis, on an internet basis, where we have it at an instant in the touch of a fingertips, that it only exacerbates that feeling, that negative feeling, that feeling of uncertainty. But when you set all of that aside and actually look at the raw numbers, what you'll find is a tremendous progress of humankind over the course of this past decade, particularly relating to technology, particularly relating to the fact that folks are using less because it's coming to us in a much more concentrated form. If you look at, for example, these statistics are from the United Kingdom. Over the course of the past 50 years, the population of the United Kingdom went up by 20%, but energy consumption went down by 10%. Again, how is that possible? Because the stuff that's getting made now is much more energy efficient than it used to be. Think about your vehicle, right? I mean, your car, much more energy efficient than it used to be. So think about those trends. Think about those trends where technology continues to develop. Technology continues to help drive decisions, make more efficient decisions. Things are getting designed more efficiently, using less resources, using less water, using less energy. That, folks, is an amazing story of what's happened not just this past decade, but in the decades before, and we believe will be a major trend for the decades ahead. We think that the next decade, we've just begun. Stop and think about this. 10 years ago, cell phones were not nearly ubiquitous as they are today. The technology was not there, and it was not nearly as powerful as it is today. What do you think that's going to look like another 10 years from now? Another 10 years from now, as they roll out 5G and 6G and 7G and whatever else over the course of the next 10 years, those are all massive technological developments that ultimately means that things work much more efficiently, cost effectively, and use less than we ever thought possible. And we think that trend and those types of trends are going to continue to help drive the markets and drive humankind. These numbers really, when you stop and take a look at, are really pretty impressive. A massive decrease in global poverty, a massive decrease in the diseases that affected people's lives. Fertility rates are better. Child deaths are lower. All of those things put together a pretty dramatic trend for improved humankind in the decades ahead. Specifically, though, for the next decade, we think this trend, particularly on a technological basis, that really helps to make things so much more efficient and effective, will be a major driver of the economy for the next 10 years. Stay tuned on that. Of course, we'll have much more on that because, after all, we do the program every week. So we'll get to see how all of that develops out over the course of the next 10 years. So when we come back, we'll hit you with a New Year's resolution. A New Year's resolution that perhaps you should add to the mix. I know we're a few days into the new year. It's not too late. Add another one on, particularly if you're an investor, because this one's going to help. We'll continue the conversation when we come back here on Dollars and Cents. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, News Radio, WFLA, Orlando. Welcome back to the program, ladies and gentlemen. This is Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, Dollars and Cents, coming to you first show of the new decade. On the last segment, we recap some of the things that we saw over the course of the past 10 years, and in particular, looking ahead to the next 10 years. It's not nearly the kind of doom and gloom that the mainstream media would like you to believe. Why do they believe that? Well, that gets us directly into this segment, which is our New Year's resolution that we want each and every one of you to add to your normal New Year's resolution. Yes, you want to lose weight. Yes, you want to exercise more, eat healthy, all that good stuff. But let's add one more, particularly if you are an investor, because as an investor, you need to make sure that you're not getting too distracted, because the reality is that there's a lot of negativity out there. And it's a psychological phenomenon that talks about the negativity bias that exists, particularly in a digital world, that magnifies its power. We don't realize how much better life is than it was because the negative gets so magnified. Some of the statistics that we talked about in the last segment about how much more efficient things are, how less energy things use, how much less resources go into the creation of something now than ever before. Those are the kinds of things that we don't hear often enough. And so the folks at the Wall Street Journal, specifically John Tierney and Roy Baumeister, wrote an article about this just this past weekend saying for the new year, say no to negativity. And I thought it was a good article in the Wall Street Journal, and we thought that we would share it particularly on this first show of 2020 because it really does get to a New Year's resolution that each and every one of us should add, and that is, as the article suggests, say no to negativity. We've certainly talked about this on the program before. The power of negative news. The power of negative news is 3 times more effective, has a 3 times greater effect on you than a single occurrence of a positive event. So the article talks about the power of 4. Basically, you need 4 positive events to offset 1 negative event of the same threshold, because the mind is so much more likely to get affected by the negative rather than the positive. And rarely a week goes by that the mainstream media doesn't talk about some thing that's going to happen that's just going to doom civilization. I mean, the list is long. All you got to do is turn the TV on and you'll get 3 or 4 over the course of an hour. But again, we don't realize how much better off we are because none of them take the time to provide that comparative analysis, which is what we're trying to do on the program this morning, kind of looking at these longer term trends, not just focusing on what's going on in any given moment. So avoiding harm should be part of that New Year's resolution about saying no to negativity, because when you do a bad act, it has a much greater effect on someone than a good act. So avoiding harm. A single bad event can often cause irreparable harm to a relationship, to a business, to a culture. So bottom line, try and avoid it. Do no harm. The rule of 4, we mentioned that earlier, taking 4 good things to overcome 1 negative thing. That's so important because the power of that negative event really can affect people's mindset. And then, most importantly, you don't learn from not making mistakes. So don't dwell on the mistakes that you made, but rather learn from them. I constantly talk to my kids about, well, there's a learning opportunity there. And I think 99% of the time when I start that spiel, that speech, I get an eye roll. But hopefully the message is coming through, and it's the same message that we're giving today, which is that mistakes aren't bad. Mistakes are bad only if you never learn from them. If you never learn from them and you repeat the same thing, you're going to keep doing more and more harm, which is going to have a much greater cumulative effect than any good that you can do. So make sure that you are learning from your mistakes. They're an opportunity to teach. They're an opportunity to learn. And if you're dwelling so much on them and avoiding the lesson, then ultimately you're going to have a hard time getting through, particularly if you are an investor. It's so important to see that big picture. We often forget of what the market has done over an extended period of time and just focus on what it's doing in a particular day, a particular week, a particular month, a particular quarter, a particular year. The reality is when you pull back those trends and you look at over a longer period of time, it really is pretty amazing and pretty staggering. If we just look at what our feelers forecast was at the beginning of the decade, that the Dow would hit 12,000, 13,000, and today it's at 28,000. That's a pretty impressive run in the markets that occurred during a period of time where the fixation in the mainstream media was doom and gloom and none of that longer term perspective. Certainly it was a good decade. As we mentioned earlier, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose a cumulative amount of 170% during that 10-year period of time, which is great. That's a good performance. But if you stack it up versus the past 100 years, it only comes in fourth out of 10 of the last 10 decades or the last 100 years. So a good decade, to say the least, but certainly a decade that was very much marred by a recovery after 2008, after 2009. So you would have thought from a market performance that given the timing that, in fact, the decade would have been much stronger because it occurred so close to the heels of a pretty major negative economic event. But in fact, only coming in at around fourth, which good decade, but not one that would say there's no room for potential growth in the decade ahead. We think that that potential for growth in the next decade spills over from the consumer finally getting into a better mental shape than what they have been. And certainly the New Year's resolution that we're talking about in this segment today is to get that mindset in a better shape. Say no to negativity, as the article in the Wall Street Journal suggested. That's so important, not just as a human being, because bad acts carry much greater weight than good. We remember the bad and not the good. It takes a lot more good than bad to help offset the negative consequences of a negative emotion. But to remember to see the big picture, so important as an investor, because if you look at performance over time, what that means is that you've got to stay consistent. You can't get distracted and move in and out of the markets. It's far too easy to do that based upon the constant dribbling of information that comes in. The problem is, though, that that information, if you lose that overall big picture, that constant information winds up ultimately causing you as an investor to react and ultimately changing your overall investment approach. And it's the changing of your overall investment approach that ultimately undermines your long-term success as an investor. So add this one to your New Year's resolutions. Say no to negativity. Remember, okay, negativity only produces a psychological result that has a much greater power. So stick with positive things. Remember the long-term picture, and you'll have a much happier 2020. Stay tuned for more on the program next week. We'll wrap it up and get on out of here, and look forward to continuing the conversation in 2020 on next week's program. This has been Dollars and Cents with your host, Joel Garris of Nelson Financial Planning, News Radio, WFLA, Orlando.